Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. These days, our vocabulary for describing sexual identity has expanded. LGBT has become LGBTQIA2, and many are using the term sexual minorities to encompass all of the varieties of sexual identity. For example, a growing number of young men are referring to themselves as mostly straight or a little bit gay. Today's guest, Dr. Ritch Savin-Williams, is an expert on fluid sexual identity. Ritch is Professor Emeritus of Developmental Psychology at Cornell University, and he has written 10 books on adolescent development, including Mostly Straight, Sexual Fluidity Among Men. Publishers Weekly has described his work as an excellent resource. Ritch works as a clinical psychologist and has served as an expert witness on same-sex marriage, gay adoption, and gender discrimination. Ritch has also consulted for media outlets such as The New York Times, 2020, The Oprah Winfrey Show, Good Morning America, and many others. So please, join me as Ritch helps us to understand sexual fluidity in today's culture. Dr. Ritch Savin-Williams, who I will be calling Ritch, welcome to Super Psyched.
Glad to be here.
I have so many questions for you, more questions probably than we actually have time for. But if you could just speak just for a moment about what is sexual fluidity?
Well, sexual fluidity is the state of having one's sexual and romantic attractions changeable over time or flexible over time, whether short-term, could be day-to-day, could be week-to-week, could be year-to-year, or circumstances or the context in which it occurs can be the critical component here. So it's as if one's sexuality exists on a spectrum rather than in terms of a category. And as a result of that sort of spectrum or continuum, that one can be at different points along that continuum at various times and contexts.
That makes so much sense. And I'm thinking about the Kinsey scale, which kind of goes from 0, I believe, to completely straight all the way up to 6, which means completely gay, and every number in between. That scale was created, I believe, in 1948. And since that time, approximately 200 similar scales have been developed. And yet sexual fluidity as a concept appears to be new. Do you have any idea as to why that is?
Well, certainly in terms of our research, we like categories. They're easier to analyze. When someone doesn't correspond to one of the response sets that we have established, then it makes it difficult. And usually those data are deleted. Now, when you actually take it research, there's always a number of people who are deleted for various reasons. And one reason is that they don't fit the categories that we have. I think that clinicians and educators and other sort of healthcare professionals, they too want to understand what's going on, and they might understand gay, straight, and bisexual. But when you put in the word fluidity, then automatically the image that comes up is, oh, you're questioning, or you're not sure, or you're afraid to say for sure what you are because you're hiding something.
Right.
So there's a real sense that if an individual says fluid or at all indicates that they are disbelieved, or they believe the person believes that he or she must be on the fence.
So there's almost some skepticism that they're meeting when they say that.
Yes. And also that we frequently don't even give them that opportunity. So they are asking for fitting into one of these boxes that we've established. And what has happened is that in this newest generation, especially the Zs, but also in terms of the millennials, they too have begun to resist these boxes and say, "Hold on a minute, your boxes, are sort of adult creations, and they don't really fit our lives."
That's incredible. You noted that with regard to sexual identity, the fastest growing group is men who describe themselves as, quote, mostly straight, but not necessarily straight, gay, or bisexual. And I'm wondering how it is that this generation is tapping into that truth, kind of being able to more accurately pinpoint where they fall on the spectrum. What has nurtured this?
Well, clearly, that for some time, in terms of women have felt that they exist much more on a spectrum, and they have been more likely to identify as fluid or as mostly straight or pansexual or queer, any variety of whatever they want to describe themselves. And we have sort of given them, if you will, this freedom because, they're women. And we don't expect women to be so categorical, or we don't believe that their sexuality is sort of biologically sort of fixated. What has changed, I think, very recently is that increasing number of men are beginning to say, hold on a minute, if women can describe their sexuality or romantic attractions in this way, we can too. And I think what has happened is that a lot of men have begun to really question the whole notion of absolute straightness.
Yeah.
So the mostly straight young man and young woman as well will say, well, I am straight, but I'm also, if I can use some of the words, a little bit gay. And I think in many ways, these mostly straight individuals are also more likely to be fluid. That is, that they are very likely to fluctuate in terms of where they are along this continuum, though very few ever go, beyond bisexual in terms of how they could identify themselves or describe themselves.
So it's as if the lexicon has changed over time to allow for men who don't have the stigma, who do have the stigma, historically have had the stigma that women haven't had around sexuality. So maybe a confluence of both the lexicon and perhaps more psychological awareness amongst the youth, any other factors perhaps in the media or just in the zeitgeist that are allowing males to tap more accurately into what their truth is?
I think that they have picked up in their culture and their pop culture and their social media that there's no harm done to be a little bit gay, if you will, or that is to have same-sex attractions. And I'm talking not just about sexual attractions, but also romantic attractions, that it is okay. It doesn't destroy your manhood. And in fact, in some quarters in their generation, it's actually a plus, a bonus that shows that you're not sort of rigid in these aspects of your personality. And I think that is a value that they have incorporated and was not previously there so much. They did face in other generations a lot of stigma if they exhibited any kinds of sort of cross-gender behavior or expression of any sorts. And that certainly held, I think, in a stronger way for young men than for young women.
I find myself a bit baffled by the idea of homophobia. What about it has made it such a stick? I mean, what about homosexuality or being a little bit gay or anywhere on the spectrum has led people to so much fear what's your sense of that historically? I mean, we had that scale since 1948, and yet only recently has fluidity come into a collective American consciousness as a thing. What about it what has caused at the root such homophobia and made it so pervasive?
I think that most likely the connection has been with homosexuality and, at least for men, femininity. And femininity for men has always meant a weakness. That is, that they are not as strong, they're not as together, if you will. That that I think in the past, this whole notion of you've got to be manly,
right,
cisgender,
right,
at this point, and I think that that has sort of led many to begin to even conceptualize the whole notion of toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
That is, that not only is it bad for men, and there is some evidence that that toxic masculinity takes its toll on men with drug addiction, low self-esteem, suicide, those kinds of things that men have thought they had to try to do. And then when they failed, then they saw there was no other option than to dismiss it, kill yourself, somehow put that aside. So I think that has been there for so many years. But I think that now there is a sort of a loosening of that kind of connection for young men. So it's harmful not only for the men, but also it's harmful for women, because what toxic masculinity frequently does is it takes away power away from women and makes them feel as if they are second class, third class, certainly on the bottom of any kind of hierarchy that you might arrange. So in that sort of spectrum, if you will, gay people have in many ways been portrayed as going the wrong direction there.
Mm. And it's almost
I just want to add that it's kind of ironic in a way that when you look at research and you look at issues of like self-esteem or self-satisfaction and psychological well-being, usually the reference group is heterosexual men. And yet, by some measures, at least from my perspective, heterosexual men are not the epitome of psychological health. And yet, when you compare, for example, sexual minorities to straight men, they look deficient. But in some ways, one could turn around and say, no, it's the straight men who are deficient. And in the strong people of the sexual minorities and the women, in terms of other aspects of what you and I would consider to be psychologically healthy.
It's interesting. Not so long ago in the DSM, our Bible for diagnosis, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that has all of the classifications of mental illness, homosexuality was actually listed among them and was finally taken out. And what you're actually noting is that in many cases, it's more likely that toxic masculinity would be, in certain heterosexual traits, might fit more appropriately in a DSM.
Right. And I want to sort of be clear that I don't think masculinity is necessarily toxic.
Absolutely not. I'm not hearing that.
Okay. I mean, I certainly do not equate those two, but I think there comes a point when the power, the desire, the mandate to be masculine does get in the way of real human beings, including males. And I think it keeps them from maybe being more sensitive, more able to express emotions, all the things that we sort of like to hear that our men are capable of doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the early aughts, Scrubs was the first TV show I had ever seen that really showed two heterosexual males having a really deep emotional connection with no threats to their sexuality. They were both clearly very straight, on the Kinsey scale. And recently in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Jake and Boyle have this just profound love for each other, and they express it very freely. Uh, and that seems to be, I think, a mirror on what's happening in a very good way. Perhaps toxic masculinity is beginning to shrink somewhat in the society. What are your thoughts on that? And actually, if you could even define toxic masculinity as you see it, uh, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, certainly, I think there is no real clear definition of toxic masculinity, but in general, when we talk about that, it's a sense of being extremely rigid in terms of what a man feels like they can act or express, that it is an unwillingness to examine feelings and emotions and sort of operate on the basis of some sort of, well, just rigidity about what a man is supposed to be.
Yes.
So there's no flexibility in that. And in many ways, they feel a part of that is to dominate women, to dominate sexual minorities, that they are at the top of the patriarchy, and that they must stay there regardless. And of course, the consequences we know all too well in our culture of men who feel that that's their mandate, that they must be like. Now, I think that what has happened for younger people is that they see those assumptions about what a quote unquote real man is being challenged in their shows that they're watching, among their friends, in the kinds of YouTube experiences that, and I think maybe especially in some of their heroes in the entertainment industry, somewhat, but less so, certainly in the sports world, that they are beginning to see that the people who are important to them don't see masculinity in this way, in a sort of in a toxic way.
Yeah. I have been seeing this on kind of as a new phenomenon with an NBA player and an NFL player coming out as gay. Some of them wearing pink, honoring women. It's there has been a change over the past few years. What good do you see coming as a result of a more integrated approach to one's sense of identity as a gender in general?
Well, I think certainly men will be those who prosper the most in that they will hopefully begin to understand that they can be more authentic in terms of what it is that's going on for them, that they will be more open to a variety of life, that they won't feel so compelled to go down particular pathways. Now, that said, I also think women will prosper immensely as well, just in terms of having the kinds of partners that they want to be with. They would be with partners who try to understand them, who try to share power, to share authority, to share their lives in a more meaningful way rather than in a more up-down, you-me kind of way. So I believe that there are very few avenues in our life which I would see that where it's a detriment, to allow men to be more fluid in their gender expression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're implying that with the decrease of rigidity, perhaps posturing and swagger, that men, one of the gifts that this could really give men as this evolution takes place is that men can be more emotionally connected, maybe more present in their lives, and maybe better partners to, assuming they're heterosexual in this case, to their female partners.
Yes.
And I've been seeing that the hallmark of a great leader is their emotional intelligence. And it sounds like with this evolution, that will, in all likelihood, be one of the predicted outcomes of this greater tapping in.
Right. It would hopefully manifest itself in fewer sort of manly bluffs and threats and one-upmanship.
Yeah.
You know, we're greater, better than you are. But one can certainly see this masculinity being displayed in certain aspects of our, in our institutions, in our cultural institutions. And I suspect maybe that's going to take a long time to erode. But I think the place to begin certainly is within individual lives. And hopefully these individual lives, once they sort of ascend to power or sources of influence, that they can make this sort of sense of one-upmanship and masculinity less important, and find other ways of maybe sharing, of trying to understand each other that would help, I think, all of our lives in a significant way.
Yeah, it's been my experience, and some of the things I have read with regard to research has been that in creating really meaningful connections with others, one-upmanship is not a really great avenue for that. Right.
It's I think this is one of those one of the things that young people have a lot to teach us, and it is, I think, in some ways expressed in the fact that more and more the young people, when they respond to our research questionnaires, they sort of object, and they are now willing to adopt a whole slew of different identities, but even which we don't necessarily know the meanings of, because some of them are sort of individualistic, that it's hard to know exactly what it is when they use certain kinds of identities. But I also think that there is a movement away from sexual identities. That is sort of what I would call sort of a post-identity that's going on among these young people. So what they would do or say, that I've increasingly encountered, is that when I ask questions of, say, sexual identity, what they will, and I give them free rein to say whatever they want, what they do is they describe things rather than putting labels on them. So even, for example, young men who are very same-sex oriented, if you will, might not say gay. What they say is, I like boys. So, that it seems like maybe that's only a subtle difference, but it's a very important one, because it's a lot easier to describe in a way, and having those descriptions change over time, where if you have an identity, then if you change that, somehow that connotes some kind of sort of inconsistency, or some kind of like, what are you saying? Just yesterday you were such and such. And so I think there is a way in which this kind of more descriptive approach towards love and romance and sex is kind of a healthy thing. So that, for example, a mostly straight guy might say, I'm straight, but I'm not blind. Or, say, I'm straight, but, if the right guy comes along, you just never know. Or I'm straight and I am having these attractions to guys, and it's kind of interesting, and I might want to explore those in the future. So once again, these are more openings rather than closures. And I think they see identity as a closure, and their way of now understanding what they are about as being very important because it gives them the freedom. It sort of reflects better their lives, which is it's in a state of change and development, and it's not singular in its trajectory, but it might take different avenues as they live their life. Now, clearly, that poses real problems for social scientists who like these boxes.
Right.
And I think what's important is that as I read the literature, and I think this has become more and more of a reality for me, is that I disbelieve a lot of the research that has been based on sexual minorities, whether that's on suicidality or any kind of sort of pathology, because I think that they have omitted many, many young people who indeed, either they're deleted because their data didn't fit or they were forced into a category that wasn't really them. So I think that if whether we are research scientists who are trying to understand our population and the way that we have done so in the past, I think distorts our knowledge. And then that knowledge is conveyed to clinicians, to health educators, to teachers, to counselors about this population, when in fact, the information we're giving them is false or certainly is incomplete. And I think that makes it even more important to get the information out there and to listen to lives and to listen to what they have to tell us, and then not simply dismiss them because it's inconvenient. And that's what strikes me about so many of these Generation Z and millennial youth and young adults is that, it's inconvenient for us and our research, and we refuse to sort of allow our research to be messy, if you will.
You are a researcher and you've done so much good work. And I'm wondering, you've just mentioned a really baffling problem about the inconvenient truth that there's a spectrum that people might not fit into particular boxes. How do you do a quantitative study on sexuality given the absence of boxes?
Well, first off, I'm not so sure I would, and I have, but I would not now, do large-scale surveys where there are only 3 options.
Right.
And so now what I've seen some researchers do is they say, please describe your sexuality, and they have an open box, and then the individual writes what they want in that. And then later on, after the fact, then you can try to make sense of some of these kinds of terms or phrases that the youth are using. Now, clearly, if you have a 200 to 300 questionnaire, that's hard to do. But then I'm not quite sure that that's helpful to compare. And let me just give you an example. So I'm currently writing about bisexuality because I've been intrigued by different aspects of it. And what's clear is that when you look at the literature, you find, depending on the gender, but 2 to 4% of people in the United States say they are bisexual.
Yeah.
Now, that's interesting in its way, in its own way, because it's so small. And then when you look at the mental health of those bisexuals, they're the worst. Okay, they're worse than gays and lesbians in terms of their mental health. But if you sort of say, okay, now let's take another look at some of this literature when you can, and not always can you, that when I begin to include other people who were deleted, I'm estimating that the percentage may be as high as 25% of the population is bisexual. Now, if you're sort of saying that what you're reporting is based on the 2 to 4, 2 to 5%, and yet you are missing the vast majority of bisexuals, then what are you saying? I mean, I almost think it'd be worse not to say anything at all than to talk about a population which doesn't represent anything. And indeed, it's conceivable that those who say they are bisexual are not only misrepresenting the bisexual population in general, but they may actually be some of the most troubled bisexuals in the population. So here we have this notion, and it's everywhere. Everywhere. And I think it probably is there among all healthcare providers that bisexuals are troubled individuals. I don't believe that. I mean, I believe the research shows that, but then I don't believe the research. So I think this is the way in which because I'm also a clinician, so I am interested in research, and I am interested in how research can help me with my clinical practice. But if I'm reading the wrong stuff and getting wrong information, am I being a good clinician under those circumstances? So that's a way in which I believe that research in some ways has harmed us to no end because of us getting these kinds of sampling problems.
So, Ritch, that was a bombshell. 25% perhaps of the population is bisexual. How did you come to that number?
And by the way, no one in the field would agree with me on that.
Sure.
I just want to be clear.
Okay.
Right. So you start including the mostly straights and mostly gays. Now, these are individuals who are who say they have some same-sex attraction. So let's take women because it's more, it's more dramatic. So let's just say 5% of women are bisexual will say they're bisexual. But there's certainly research that 10 to 15% of women say they're mostly straight. Now, what happens to those mostly straight women? Oh, lo and behold, they get combined with the straights. So you mentioned the Kinsey scale. So mostly straights on this 0 to 6 scale are ones, Kinsey ones. But they get combined with the zeros. Why?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why. But they're really bisexual. Why are they bisexual? Because they have attractions to both sexes.
Yep.
So right there, automatically with women, you are now up to at least 15%, maybe 20%. And that's not even including the other end, the fives, who are mostly lesbian, who really are bisexual, even though they get combined with lesbians. There's also individuals who are trans, many trans people, maybe as much as a third, some say a half, but I'll go with a third, are bisexual. What happens to them in our research? Or those who are into kink. A lot of kink people are really bisexual. Or we have all those who get deleted because they refuse to answer. Why are they refusing to answer? Maybe they're refusing to answer because they don't like our question. They refuse to fit into a box. And there's just these kinds of things are people who say they're unsure or they're questioning. Are they questioning because they don't know if they're gay or straight? So when you really sort of begin to count all these individuals, then indeed what happens is like, what are these people who are deleted? For example, in most good research, national research, you could get 10 to 12% of all questionnaires you have to throw away because they didn't fit one of their boxes, the gay, lesbian, bisexual, straight box. Who are these individuals? Are they all straight? Are they all gay, lesbian? Maybe a certain percent of them are bisexual if you really were to know. So those are the kinds of ways where I think all we have to do is sort of open our mind a little bit and say, well, maybe you don't have to say you're bi to be bi.
That is incredible. So we have a sample size of 300 people who are in the study, and many people have maybe opted out. And we really don't have a randomized group of 300, in other words.
That's right. And, we almost never, and I'll underline the word never, know who those who drop out, why they drop out. And there could be a number of reasons. I'm not saying because they're all bi,
right.
But we don't know anything at all about those 30 or more individuals who dropped out because or they might have not have dropped out, but they might not have completed that sexual orientation question.
Mm-hmm.
And they probably didn't answer that for various reasons, but I'm guessing that some of those may have dual attractions.
You said that many of your colleagues might not agree with the number that you cited, 25%, and yet you are a man who has been working in the field at the highest level. I mean, you were even in the national licensure exam. Your credibility is unquestionable. I wonder what issues would they take with that figure that you are postulating?
Well, I think the approach of most of my peers would be something, oh, that's Ritch. Yeah. He's just on this crusade, which may be true. But on the other hand, I think what has happened to me over the last, I think, decade or so, and actually it's probably been true throughout my life, which is that you just have to listen to kids. And the amazing thing is that most of the researchers on adolescent development, on these kinds of issues, have never really talked with kids. They don't know kids. They wouldn't know how to talk with kids. And so what I try to do in my life has always been to keep in touch with them, so that, for example, the last 15 years, is that I've done workshops for kids in Storrs, Connecticut for the True Colors group, which is 3,000 kids come together for a weekend to talk about issues of gender and sexuality. And for me, it's the best time I have in the entire year, because there they are, these kids who just want to talk. And I don't say anything. I just let them talk. And then I take notes like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Because I want to know what they are saying, and I want to know how they're experiencing their lives and what it's like. And they are so negative about the kinds of adult researchers that are publishing in major journals in sexuality studies, because they say, well, I won't say what they say because anyway, but they just disbelieve it and they just dismiss us so quickly. And so for me, I would go toe to toe with any of these researchers and say, okay, let's sit down and let's talk about what's going on here and whether your data are believable or not. And I really would love for them to do that, because I think that there could be potentially a seismic shift in how we approach young people. And I do understand their perspective. They've got to publish. They've got tenure to make. They've got research grants to submit. And there is a reality, which is that that applications for research that emphasize the resilience and the strength and the sort of the normalness, if you will, or the typicality of sexual minority youth and young adults, that doesn't exist. We only fund what goes wrong with them. And I think what we have done over the years is that we know how to recruit young people who will satisfy what goes wrong with you. We know how to ask the right questions, and we know how to define those kids. A good example is something I spent a decade fighting, and I've given up now because it's nothing I can do about it, which is the whole notion of suicidality among sexual minority youth. And there are a lot of reasons why that literature is horribly flawed, and yet it has reached sort of the standard knowledge. If you ask any kid, and sometimes I ask the youth that I'm doing the workshop with, what is the one thing you know about sexual minority youth? They go, we kill ourselves better than anyone else. And, they laugh because they think that's kind of funny. And it is kind of funny, but it's also extraordinarily sad that this is the message that has been conveyed to them by adults and by our culture. It's on national public radio. It's on CNN. It's on MSNBC. Any of those kinds of even liberal. You don't have to do the conservative ones. The liberal ones say, "Oh, these poor youth, they're killing themselves at just huge rates," and yet it's not true. But you can't convince that it's not true.
Wow.
I've tried, and
Sure.
it has failed. And it's not just about this kind of severe suicidality. Another example is that we frequently look at depression, and what you find is that gay youth are more likely to be depressed. Okay, study after study, there have been maybe, I start to say hundreds, but there hasn't been that many. There have been scores of studies that have found gay youth are more depressed. Now, more depressed than who? Well, they're more depressed than straight men say they are. Now, we also know that straight men would never admit or would certainly downplay their depression. We know that from our previous conversation here about toxic masculinity. But if you compare those gay male youth with women, lo and behold, there's no difference.
Right.
Now, why shouldn't we compare gay males to straight women? That makes more sense in some ways than it does to compare them with straight men. And I'm just giving that as an example of how a myth has arisen where in reality there's a very, very different story. And I think what it is gay men have the sense of self-reflection, of admitting, okay, I'm kind of sad today, sort of more in touch with their emotionality. And that's why, of course, women will rate as more depressed than men, is because they're more in touch with their inner feelings, their emotional selves, and they're probably less likely to lie on our depression scales. For depression scales for men, you look at acting out and aggression and drinking and drugs as maybe more reflective of depression than you would a question that says, during the last week, have you felt sad over some known or unknown sort of aspect?
One of my favorite words in our profession is alexithymia. It's such a fancy sounding word, and it means the inability to really put words to your emotions. And I imagine that that within the straight male community, alexithymia is quite pervasive, which may account, at least in part, for the underrepresentation of straight males being depressed or even anxious. It seems like the incidence of straight women experiencing depression or anxiety is higher, and that there are many people who believe that's erroneous.
Yes, and I saw one study, I can't recall where it was now, that actually sort of looked at different ways of measuring depression, and when you made it more gender specific, men, there was no real gender difference.
Right.
It's just how you define what it is you want to assess. And I think that young people, sort of as they become more in touch with their own inner feelings, will be more, if you will, female-like. And I think that may be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I see what you mean. The ability to, when you think about even some of the qualities that an introvert might have, we're beginning to see the upside of introversion in a very extroverted nation, whereas, say, the Scandinavian countries are far more introverted. And there seems to be a real power amongst introverts, and perhaps similarly, there's a real power amongst being more tapped into one's feminine side. Carl Jung really talked extensively about all humans having masculine and feminine qualities, regardless of their sexual identity. And what I'm kind of hearing in the margins is that maybe there's gold there.
Yes, I agree. I very much agree.
I'm going to geek out for a second. In the 90s, if I recall correctly, there were some postmortem studies on the brains of straight males, females, and gay males, and that they found that hypothalamus, a region within the brain, a particular portion of the hypothalamus, to be really specific, was 50% smaller amongst gay and females than it was relative to the straight male. And I'm wondering, are there any other neurobiological indicators that really can be attributed to sexual differences?
Well, that study by LaVey was not replicated by several others.
Oh, no kidding.
And it was replicated by one other. Part of the problem maybe was that his gay male brains died of AIDS by and large. But I think that there have been other sort of genetic studies that have been done. They have some problems with replicating these studies. I think that what the current understanding is that there are multiple genes that influence attractions, desires, gender expression, and that whether it means that you need more than a certain number in order to be gay or bi or whatever, or whether some genes are more important than others. And so I think that as a result of this, most of the research now is not sort of going in that direction. The funding is difficult. And it just looks as if that is just so much a story of multiple genes, and we're not going to be able to identify one or two or three major genes that sort of cause it, sort of sexuality. I think that some of the direction has been, looking at twin studies and other things, and it's clear that there is a biological substrate to sexual orientation in both sexes. The problem is that there's a lot of variance that's not accounted for. That is, we just don't know what may be going on. Now, it could be as well the interaction of the prenatal environment and the sort of the hormonal and biological endocrine system there that interacts with whatever is genetically laid down. So it's so complicated, and I think there's a lot of feeling like sort of so what? Because even gay advocates now say, we shouldn't have to prove that we're born that way in order for us to have human rights. And I think, too, that as we begin to see that that sexuality is not a matter of either or, but is on a continuum, then it becomes even more complicated. Like, how do you do genetic studies of pansexuals or, questioning, or people who are into kink or who are trans? So there's so much complexity now that I think the simple mindedness of finding a quote unquote gene or part of the brain that causes sexuality has been sort of downplayed, maybe dismissed. And I think that the attitude more is like, it doesn't matter particularly.
Yeah, especially because there should be, and I agree with that statement, that their human rights should not need to be justified by some biological basis.
Right.
Yeah, I really get that. And yet, I do find it fascinating. In spite of that fact, I'm going to ask you one other question kind of related to that just kind of showed up just now in our flow. There has, to my knowledge, been some studies that indicate that there's even an evolutionary basis. There's that it's been good for the species to have homosexuals in our tribe. And sexual minorities within our tribe, which sounds in many ways counterintuitive. Are you aware of those studies? Do you agree with them? Can you expand on what they're saying?
Now, do you mean across species or across cultures?
Particularly within the human species, I'm going to speak of.
Right. So I think it's fair to say from the anthropologist perspective that they have never found a culture in which there wasn't same-sex attractions or behavior that was there. Maybe to varying degrees, whether that depends on the willingness or the ability of that culture to suppress it or to encourage it. So I think that it certainly is close to universal. I think that there has been some development of theories about how this could be sort of evolutionarily advantageous, and people have come up with, I think, interesting possibilities. Of course, we don't know, but I think in my own thinking of this is that, evolution loves variety. They don't, our genetic code is not oriented only for one outcome. Multiple outcomes is what has made us such a successful species compared to many others. So it would make sense in some ways for there to be an adaptation to having same-sex attractions. Just to give an example, if you're sending hunters out to gain protein hunting, maybe it might be an advantage to have same-sex attractions or same-sex behavior if you're wanting the hunting group to really coalesce and form a bond and so forth, and also, to have pleasure away from women, the females, for a long period of time, or for women to connect and bond in order to help with child rearing. All of these things one could hypothesize would encourage some degree of same-sex bonding. Now, whether it's total gayness, if you will, that is selected for is not the issue. It's maybe that some degree of same-sex attractions is advantageous, and in some situations you get extremes, all along the continuum. I think anyone who says it doesn't make any evolutionary sense is they don't know evolutionary theory very well. There are many possibilities, and I just named just one, but there are others that are out there.
Wow, that is amazing. I guess I'm going to close on this question, and this has been just wonderful. Sadly, challenges remain in our society around awareness as it pertains to sexual minorities. And I'm wondering, what is your deepest hope regarding the public's awareness of sexual minorities and sexual identity over the forthcoming years?
So my biggest hope is that we will listen to young people, because I think they're pointing us in the right direction. That is, of extraordinary diversity in the expression of sexuality and romance that opens the doors to many expressions. And I'm hoping that we as adults can listen to them and can explore some of the ways in which that kind of diversity strengthens our culture, strengthens us as human beings. And if that happens, I'd be thrilled.
Well, cheers to that, Ritch. And thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with me and to share your wisdom with our listening audience. I can't thank you enough.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and thanks for asking.
You bet. I look forward to connecting with you again soon.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.